All right, so what I want to get through today is just a quick reading through of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the simple reason that it is the document that is definitive for how people understand human rights around the world. Whether people agree with them or disagree with them, whether people want to critique human rights or uphold them and propagate them, this is the document that is definitive. It was the product of a drafting committee following World War II that was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt and was made up of there were a couple of different drafting committees composed of different representatives from different countries, but among the representatives were, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt from the U.S. There was a British, a Canadian, an Australian, a Peruvian, a Chinese, a Soviet Russian delegate, an Egyptian delegate. So it was a committee made up on an international foundation, of course. And yet, what I want to propose is that what we see in this document is a set of principles that are overwhelmingly traceable to concepts developed in Western philosophy. Western philosophy being not a very good term, but roughly corresponding to the philosophy that emerged from Greece initially and then spread through Western Europe and the Americas following that, and that has therefore been closely identified with the intellectual and social and political development of what, again, equally problematically is thought of as the Western world, essentially Europe and North America in particular, and in particular English North America. So, okay. The document then was hashed out by this group. There was not a straightforward path to getting from their initial meetings to this final document. It truly was a document that the committee arrived at through long deliberation, through dozens and dozens of meetings, by consulting constitutions and other documents from other states around the world. And so it was very, very carefully drafted, so that what you wind up with here is a document that was not built on just an immediate consensus about what human rights are, as if they were simply transparent, but rather a long, arduous process of working out what they took human rights to be. And we'll see as we go through it that there are different influences bearing on different parts of the document, so that there is a strong emphasis toward the beginning on political rights, on rights of conscience, and then later a set of imperatives around things like cultural rights and economic rights that bear the stamp of the Soviet delegation. So, okay, anyway, let's get into it so that we can start to get our bearings and start to get a sense of what is at stake in the different readings that we're going to have down the road. So it starts off, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. So let's pause there for a moment. We'll see that ideas like inherent dignity are important inheritors of Kant. Equal and inalienable rights also, in my view, reads directly from Kant. The idea that we are a human family in the sense that we are in possession of the same basic inheritance as one another, also, I think, deriving from Kant. And the ideas of the relationship between freedom and justice, and by extension, peace in the world. I think these are concepts that are all direct inheritors of Kantian philosophy. So the disregard of these things has led to barbarous acts which outrage the conscience of mankind. Now, it's important to note that at the time that the drafters were starting to draft this, right around the end of the war, this was before the full extent of the Nazi genocidal projects were even known, right? One of the things that the Nazis did extremely well was keep the genocide of especially Jewish Europeans secret. They did an astonishing job of that, especially given the scale of that genocide. So that was even before that. Now, as that became more well known, human rights took on an even greater immediacy than they did at the start of the drafting process. But even before that, what they're referencing here is the combined devastation of both the First and the Second World War, and the idea that then there is a kind of shared human conscience that rebels against the kind of barbarity that we saw in these two wars. Now, from there, then, it moves on to these basic principles of freedom of speech and belief that we'll see derive principally from John Stuart Mill. We'll get to him in 3 classes from now. And he's one of the most influential, still to this day, theorizers of freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. So it continues. Whereas it is essential if man, and now we know also women, if, let's say, humanity, is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Now, this is an important addition as well, right? So that on the one hand, it casts human rights as intrinsically opposing tyranny and oppression. So then human rights are in the service of all these freedoms, but also are in the service of opposing tyranny and oppression, and that they should be protected in the rule of law. So there's an acknowledgement here that human rights are not necessarily written into law, that there can be laws that are tyrannical, there can be laws that are oppressive, and the correction that they are proposing is the writing into law of human rights as a way of unraveling tyranny and oppression. Whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations. Again, this is coming immediately after the Second World War. Whereas the peoples of the United Nations have in the Charter reaffirmed their faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, and in the equal rights of men and women, and have determined to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, whereas member states have pledged themselves to achieve, in cooperation with the United Nations, the promotion of universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms. So again, I just want to flag the importance of this idea of universality. This is something that is explicit in not in Locke's work. It's explicit in Kant's work, and it is implicit or latent in Mill's work. But really, the way that Mill considers freedom of speech and freedom of conscience, it's simply impossible to think of those without thinking of them as universal concepts. And so the UN, recognizing that these have not been present for all peoples around the world, are promoting the idea that the universal quality of these principles has to be respected. It goes on, whereas a common understanding of these rights and freedoms is of the greatest importance for the full realization of this pledge. Now, therefore, the General Assembly proclaims this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the peoples of the member states themselves and among the peoples of the territories under their jurisdiction. So, okay, the final part of the preamble then gets to the idea that human rights have not been realized and respected in all places, so that there's a kind of aspirational quality to the declaration as well, as if to say that those nations that sign on to it are making a commitment to a particular vision of the future, a vision of a future that is not realized, it doesn't exist in the present, but is something towards which all of the member states and the territories under their control can aspire. Okay, the first article then. So then, again, I want to emphasize that the first section reflects a particular set of fairly just liberal philosophical and political principles. So then all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Again, as I say, this to me is a clear echo of Kant. They are endowed with reason and conscience. Again, for Kant, these two things are inseparable and should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Kant finds this to be simply a natural conclusion from the philosophical principles around reason that he sets up, reason, autonomy, freedom that he sets up, that they will naturally extend to all people. Next, Article 2, everyone is entitled to the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitation of sovereignty. So this is not going to be as transparently derived from Kant, and yet I think once again it is. Why? Because Kant is making a pitch for a universal set of moral principles. And what the Declaration is doing here is saying that none of these things, race, color, sex, language, religion, and so forth, count as disqualifications from that universal heritage of reason in particular that gives us a claim simply as human beings on the universal freedoms and the universal principles, the universal rights outlined in the Declaration. Now, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. This, if it doesn't sound like an echo of the U.S. Constitutional principle of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it should. Again, as I said, the committee drafting this consulted constitutions from around the world. And so you'll hear echoes of some of the constitutional principles informing the American Constitution and several of the amendments. A further one that is a close echo of the 14th Amendment in the 14th or 4th? 14th. In the 13th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, to the U.S. Constitution, is no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. So there's a cognizance then that on the one hand, there's a particular kind of philosophical heritage from Europe and the Americas that's very important in forming the document. But there's also a specific history closely associated with Europe and the Americas that has to be implicitly acknowledged as part of the barbarous history that the Declaration is trying to dissolve. So no one shall be subject to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Now, again, to my mind, this sounds very much like an echo of what we'll see in Kant. Why? Because each of these things, torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, all of these are direct contraventions of human dignity on the one hand, and this is a phrase that will make more sense after we've gone through his piece. They refuse to recognize humans' natural autonomy as reasoning beings. It treats them as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves, and that is a violation of human dignity. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. So again, I think that this is a fairly straightforward constitutional notion that goes back to the earlier article that simply doesn't allow for any exclusions, right? That there's no intrinsic reason that anybody on the basis of any kind of characteristic or status can simply be excluded from recognition as a person before the law. To lose your status as a person before the law is again to lose your status as an individual with intrinsic dignity, that being the core principle of the Declaration. All humans are equal before the law. Again, same idea, same principle, that because we are all possessors of reason, we are in that sense equal. So this is not a descriptive statement. It's not saying that everybody gets treated equally before the law. It clearly knows that that's not the case. But, or rather the committee clearly knows that that is not the case, but rather that the principle is that all people ought to be treated as equal before the law and entitled without discrimination to equal protection of the law. Again, no exclusions. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement to such discrimination. Everyone has the right to an effective remedy by the competent national tribunals or courts for acts violating the fundamental rights guaranteed him by the Constitution or by law. So again, nobody on the basis of any sort of exclusionary criteria can simply be can have an effective remedy withheld from them, so that it can't be the case that a court or a tribunal finds in your favor and then says, well, no, you're not entitled to this ruling because of some arbitrary quality. Nobody shall be subject to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Simply then, the idea that the law has to apply equally and evenly to everyone, and it has to be based in regularized, predictable, codified ways, so that the law is not this kind of arbitrary thing that can be exercised at the whim of some people against others. So that you could think to times in European history as an example, when the law was simply whatever the monarch said the law was at that time. And that introduces an arbitrary quality to it. Anybody can be subject to persecution at any moment on the whim of the ruler or the sovereign. And that is, in a sense, that is no principle of law at all. That means that there is nothing regularized, codified, predictable that allows people to know when they are obeying the law and when they are not. Why? Because the law is simply the whim of the sovereign or of the monarch or of the ruler at that time. There are states where that is the case. North Korea is probably the best example of a state that is run where arbitrary arrest is a common occurrence. And so there is a sense then that there is no rule of law. There is only the application of force in an arbitrary way that can be made up more or less as the ruling tranche wishes. Okay, anyway, carrying on. Number 10, everyone is entitled to full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal in the determination of his rights and obligations and of any criminal charge against him. Part of what this is pushing back against then is the idea that there can be secret courts, that the law can be something that is adjudicated in secret, not in the full light of day, not in the full presence of the public. Why? Because carrying out the law, carrying out criminal trials in secret, is exactly what allows for the kind of arbitrariness and injustice cited in the previous article. 11. Everyone charged with a penal offense has the right to be presumed innocent until proved guilty according to law in a public trial at which he has all the guarantees necessary for his defense. Further, no one shall be held guilty of any penal offense on account of any act or omission which did not constitute a penal offense under national or international law at the time when it was committed. Nor shall a heavier penalty be imposed than the one that was applicable at the time the penal offense was committed. So a couple of things are important in this article. The first, the idea of being presumed innocent. The difficulty in some legislation, we can take, because we're going to get there eventually, the example of lèse majesté laws in Thailand. Lèse majesté laws are laws that say that anything that appears critical of the monarchy is a criminal offense. So anything that degrades public opinion of the monarchy, anything that mocks them, anything that defames them in any perceivable or potential way, that those are things that are punishable by law. Now, the problem is that with that kind of law, effectively, when you're charged with it, you're presumed innocent, you're presumed guilty, and you have to prove your innocence. But you have to do that in a way that's nearly impossible. And in part because you're often not allowed to present evidence, because presenting evidence of lèse majesté would be to duplicate the offense, and therefore it can't be allowed in court, and it certainly can't be part of the public record. So partly it's pushing back against that idea that you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent. And again, you can't prove a negative in that way, all right? So that you can't prove that you're not guilty of having done something in the way that someone can prove that you are guilty to the satisfaction of a court, which gives you the presumption of innocence. And the following part of that is that if the law changes down the road and something becomes illegal that didn't used to be, or something becomes criminal that used to be a misdemeanor, they're saying you can't retroactively, as a state, you can't retroactively go back and charge somebody with something that wasn't illegal before when they were doing that thing, or impose a heavier sentence on them, say jail time instead of a fine, because at the time the sentence was lighter than it is under the new law. 12, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor attacks upon his honor or reputation. So this is a straightforward defamation law that you're entitled to your privacy and your good name against false allegations, so that nobody can deride your reputation, can defame you, which again is something that states have relied upon in the past. So that if you have a critic of a state, one of the ways that states have responded to that is by tarnishing the name of that individual, discrediting them, and in so doing, neutralizing them because they lose their social position. In a sense, they cease to become social persons within that society any longer. 13, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Now, this is something that is responding, I think, very closely to the politics of the time. And in part, they are a dig at the policies of Nazi Germany that would withdraw individual citizenship on the strength of there being such things as the wrong religion or the wrong ethnicity or the wrong sexuality. And that, again, that has that kind of arbitrary quality to it that the earlier articles were pushing back against. And secondly, then, it's resisting the idea that you can be expelled from a country and refused from your home country, that you can be expelled and not allowed to return to your home country, so that you can't have exile imposed upon you. 14, everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution, right? So then the idea that if you're persecuted in your own country, you can't simply become an international pariah on the strength of that you are entitled to seek refuge elsewhere when you're being persecuted within the country that you're in. This right may not be invoked in the case of prosecutions genuinely arising from non-political crimes or from acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So in short, if you broke the law somewhere, then you broke the law there, and you have to face the regular consequences of having broken the law. Again, this articulates in an important way with the earlier articles about arbitrariness of law, right? Because they're saying laws have to be regularized, equally applied to all citizens, and that they have to honor certain freedoms, like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and so forth. So that when we get to this one, the only laws that remain will be, according to the United Nations, legitimately criminal acts. So that you can't commit a criminal act in a country and then claim that you're seeking asylum because you've been charged for those criminal acts. It's not a get out of jail free card, in other words. 15, everyone has a right to a nationality, and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality or her nationality, nor denied the right to change nationality. So again, this goes back to the idea that the Nazis, and not the Nazis alone, other countries have done this as well, used as one of their mechanisms for socially and politically marginalizing specific populations within their borders, the removal of their nationality so that they lose all their rights as citizens. 16. Men and women of full age, an unfortunately vague designation, but we get the idea that different countries are going to have different notions of what the age of majority is. So anyway, men and women of full age without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion have the right to marry and found a family. They are entitled to equal rights as to marriage, during marriage, and at its dissolution. Marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of the intending spouses. The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by society and the state. I think that these are fairly straightforward. They don't require much commentary. There is a particular cultural slant to these notions of marriage, but what they, after having committed themselves to ideas like the freedom and autonomy of the individual person, it's hard then to come back to the notion that something like marriage should not be subject to the consent of the individuals engaging in it. 17, everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. Okay, now we're finally getting to the sections that draw from John Locke's philosophy, which we'll see after we talk about Mill. Locke, in my view, is the third really huge contributor, philosophical contributor, to the concepts in the Declaration. So his writing around property in relation to freedom is important and is reflected here. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his or her religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his or her religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. This again draws, I think, directly from Mill, as we'll see. The whole notion of freedom of conscience is tied to his writing of freedom of expression. 19, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. Again, this, I think, comes directly from Mill's On Liberty. We'll see that this article draws straight from the pages of that book. 20, everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. No one may be compelled to belong to an association. Same, these are ideas drawing explicitly from Mill. 21. An absolutely straightforward democratic principle. So it could be from the American Constitution. It could be from any number of constitutions from any number of European countries, not to mention a host of other constitutions. Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. So a straightforward democratic principle. This is an interesting and contentious article because there are some places, both at that time and through to the present, that will say, well, no, we don't organize our government on democratic principles. What we need are, and then fill in the blank. We need wise leaders. We need good people in government. That's something, again, that arises frequently in Thailand as a way of limiting democratic involvement of the populace. So this is not an uncontroversial article to include. And yet I think that what we see is that having made the commitments that they've made earlier on in the declaration, this is a natural consequence of it. That especially when we think about Kant, the idea that people have a voice in creating the laws under which they live is a very Kantian notion. So it follows directly from the precedents that they've set earlier on. Everyone has the right to equal access to public service in his country. Now we're starting to see the influence as well of the Soviet delegate. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage. So explicitly saying then both men and women, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. So a return to democratic principles. 22, everyone as a member of society has the right to social security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation, and in accordance with the organization and resource of each state, of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. This comes directly from the Soviet delegate to the drafting committee and is closely in line with the Soviet interpretation of Marxist principles at that time. So the idea then of the existing state as the guarantor and provider of certain kinds of equality, of social security, of a way of ensuring the elimination of some level of poverty, not at this point poverty entirely, but making sure that there's a floor below which nobody in society is allowed to fall, and that the idea of the realization of the person is a right. It's something that can't be compromised or squandered in the Marxist view by compulsion to perform, say, certain kinds of labor under impossible circumstances. 23, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. Again, this should be fairly obviously the product of the Soviet delegation. Everyone without any distinction has the right to equal pay for equal work. Same thing. Everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family, and herself and her family, an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. 4, everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of his interests. Again, I think these should be fairly obviously the economic principles that the Soviet delegation wanted to ensure were protected as fundamental human rights. 24 then. Everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. Again, that's a contribution by the Soviet delegate. 25. Nearing the end, we're almost there. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. So these are things, having ensured earlier that people have the right to property and as individuals or in communion with other people. Here, this is the Soviet delegation trying to introduce some insurance that what they see as the natural outcomes of capitalism are that there's some security against the natural consequences of capitalism. So the production of poverty, the necessity of unemployment for the functioning of a capitalist economy as a way of maintaining low wages near the subsistence level. That these things and the natural consequences being exclusion from things like medical care, all of these things are natural outcomes of capitalism. They're not things that may or may not emerge from capitalism. In this view, they're inevitable natural outcomes. And so therefore, every society and every state has to ensure certain guarantees that individuals who are caught on the bad side of capitalism are to make sure that they're taken care of in a way. Okay, and then motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. All children, whether born in or out of wedlock, shall enjoy the same social protection. I think that's straightforward. I don't think that takes any sort of decoding. 26. Everyone has the right to education. Again, this was, interestingly enough, this was one of the Soviet delegates' principal contributions, the insistence on access to education. In part, this is because the Soviets had looked at the way that the U.S. in particular had systematically declined access to education to slaves, and then later to freed slaves, and then later to their ancestors, Black Americans. And so they had a history of justifiably being harshly critical of America, as America presented itself as the seat of freedom in the world, and was pointing out, well, no, you have a history of systematically excluding people from, among other things, access to education. So then they include this article: education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages, so that there's no economic barrier to access. Elementary education shall be compulsory, so that there's no sort of loophole to exclude certain individuals or certain categories of person. Technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. So favoritism on the basis of, say, wealth or name or standing or connections, that's out. It's a merit-based system. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. Parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given their children, which again is not a particularly surprising thing given what we've just seen about the centrality of the family just a couple of articles earlier. 27. Everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. Everyone has the right to protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. So again, interestingly, the first part of this is a contribution of the Soviet delegate, and the second may not have been from the Soviet delegate. It might have been one of the others, ensuring that the, so to speak, the author of a scientific or a literary product is able to maintain a claim on that as the author. 28. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms of this set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. Once more, this is a straightforward response to World War and the claim, in so many words, that the destabilizing of the world system by a global war is a direct violation of human rights. 29. Everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. Now, this was an early debate amongst the delegates. Early on, there was a notion that you only had access to rights insofar as you fulfilled duties, that with rights comes duties. There was a very lively debate about whether this should be the obligation imposed upon anyone who wanted to claim rights. Now, really, the side that won out was the side that said, no, if we're saying that these are intrinsic rights, then there's nothing you need to do in order to lay claim to these rights. That we get them just by being human. That either we have rights as a natural outgrowth of our human dignity, or we don't. We claim that we do, and therefore there's no obligation that you have to fulfill in order to lay claim to those rights. Now, the only limitation that we're going to see with that is from a piece by Kant that I'm not asking you to read, but that I'll comment upon, that says essentially the only duty that anyone winds up having as a result of rights like these, or principles of justice, is the duty not to interfere with other people's exercise of those same rights, that same access to justice. So my rights then impose on all of you the duty not to violate my rights. Equally, your rights impose on me exactly the same duty, that I have the duty to observe rights of others. But I don't have any other duty that I need to do or that I need to fulfill in order to lay claim to my own rights, just as nobody else does. So that was the debate that occurred. That was the side that wound up winning. So this article is sort of the concession that they wound up giving to those, I think it was the UK delegate who insisted upon this initially. So this is the concession that he gets to recognize duties. So everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. In the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others and of meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare of a democratic society. So that, I think, is as straightforward a rearticulation of what we get from the Kant piece as you could hope for. These rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Finally, 30. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, group, or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth herein. It might seem a bit redundant, but they feel the need at the end to say that that there's nobody who can sort of give themselves a special claim to denigrate or violate the rights that have been set out above, that these rights are inviolable in principle. In fact, of course, we find out that they are violated all the time, but the point is that they're giving articulation to rights in such a way that when states violate them, it is now clear that they are violating rights. They're not simply exercising their sovereignty. They're not simply doing what they feel entitled to do to their citizenry or to their subjects. Rather, they are now on notice that they are violating human rights. Okay, that's it. So next week we will get to Immanuel Kant's work. It is not an easy read. It's not particularly long, but he's not an elegant writer. He has a huge amount of technical vocabulary that will get in your way and slow you down. So let me take this moment to encourage you, start reading early. Give yourself lots of time. You might find that you need to read at least portions of this, maybe the whole thing, more than once in order to get a handle on what he's talking about. But if you get through it and you think, this is just, it's all clouds to me, I can't see what's going on, don't panic. I'll explain as well as I can what it is that he's talking about and why it's so important, why Kant, probably more than anyone, is the foundational writer for the Declaration of Human Rights, or the foundational inspiration for the Declaration of Human Rights. Okay, until then,